We want to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Caren Solomon. Dr. Solomon is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and a deputy editor at the New England Journal of Medicine. At the New England Journal of Medicine, she oversees the ongoing fossil fuel pollution and climate change series. She has published and lectured widely on the effects of climate change on health and how healthcare professionals can take action. She also serves on institutional and statewide advisory committees on climate change. Please welcome Dr. Solomon.
Wait for the music. So thank you so much for having me. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Okay, so we have already heard a lot about how climate change is real and it's accelerating, so much for the hoax theory, and is really leading to breaking of records constantly with respect to heat and wildfires and storms and floods. So just to lay out there, what is the root cause? It's largely our continued burning of fossil fuels, which account for about 3/4 of total greenhouse gas emissions, and also are the largest source of air pollution, which has already been mentioned today, and is worsening with climate change-fueled wildfires. So as greenhouse gases have increased, so too, as you know, have temperatures. And I would point out that last year, the global average temperature was 1.4 degrees higher than prior to the Industrial Revolution. And this year is projected to be worse. Okay, so you guys will be familiar with the Paris Climate Agreement, which we may be soon not part of again, but that had the ideal goal of keeping that warming to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I just want to show you, for example, the difference with respect to some impacts of a 1.5 versus 2 degree rise. So if you get up to 2 degrees, you have about twice as many people exposed to water scarcity and more than twice as many exposed to severe heat waves. Now, unfortunately, even keeping warming to 2 degrees is seeming vanishingly out of reach. So this was a projection coming from a couple of years ago based on policies in place then that had us heading to somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees of warming without just some substantial reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's been pointed out that any further delay in action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. Okay, so what are the implications of the climate change we've already experienced for women? And you've already heard a lot about many of these issues, so I'm going to kind of buzz through, but then give you a couple of specific examples that we haven't talked about in any depth. Okay, so as mentioned, there are direct and indirect effects of our burning fossil fuels. So air pollution, rising temperature, rising sea levels, and increasingly extreme weather events are acting both directly but also indirectly through, as you have heard, effects on air quality, water quality and quantity, food safety and supply, vector distribution and ecology, and social upheaval. And as a result, you see an enormous array of adverse health outcomes that have been linked to climate change. And again, has been mentioned, vulnerable groups are at highest risk, and among those groups are women, particularly pregnant women, and particularly low-income women and women of color. So just to highlight that, this was a review of 130 studies that looked at sex differences in climate change impacts. And over 2/3 of them found that effects were greater in women than men. Areas that were worse in women ranged from effects of extreme weather and food insecurity to mental health harms, and then to reproductive and maternal health harms. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of examples of the latter given the time constraints. So these data come from a systematic review of numerous studies done in the US and looking at associations between air pollution and extreme heat and pregnancy complications. And what you can see is that the vast majority of studies are showing that both of these, so again, particulate air pollution and extreme heat, are linked to significantly higher risks of preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth. And then you can see that many of these studies also showed these racial disparities with non-white women suffering more. Now, this is actually a natural experiment, and it looked across 8 areas of California where there had been coal and oil power plants that were retired. And the investigators looked before and after at preterm birth rates. For women living within 5 to 10 kilometers of these plants, there was a significant drop in preterm birth when those plants were retired, and that was not seen in women living farther away and less exposed to that pollution. Now, fortunately, in the interest of time, you've already heard a lot about the items on the right of the slide. So there are other environmental factors that are occurring with fossil fuels that are harming pregnancies. So I'm going to just focus for a sec on the left, just to remind you that the ubiquitous endocrine disruptors in our environment, most are fossil fuel derived. Plastics, microplastics, and they're causing tremendous pregnancy harms. As I'm sure you know, microplastics have been found in the placenta as well as blood, urine, elsewhere in the body. And then again, remembering that these extreme weather events not only affect access to care, but they cause mental health harms, depression, anxiety, they increase interpersonal violence, a lot of results that again compromise pregnancies, and then we've talked about various vector-borne diseases that are increasingly common as we have increased heat and changes in precipitation. They're spreading geographically, and also the seasons during which these insects are active are lasting longer. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of terrible things, okay? And we also were not doing enough to address them. But I want to emphasize there have been real reasons for hope, and I list some on this slide, and I want to primarily point to the fact that the cost of renewable energy has dropped dramatically. And therefore, it has been widely being developed and rolled out, both in and more so even now outside of the US. Now, obviously, there is tremendous concern that with the new administration, we're going to see rollbacks in progress that has been made. But the fact is that states have been very active in this and local governments, and there is no reason, at least right now, that many of them cannot continue on that trajectory. And there is actually hope that the IRA, which is being targeted, that there's a number of people in districts, red states, who are benefiting from the IRA in terms of incentives received for decarbonization, and there's evidence that some legislators from those states are actually not enthusiastic about complete rollback, so perhaps that will be helpful. I do want to point out that I think one of the biggest hopeful signs is the increasing numbers of people who actually are worried about this issue, and that has increased enormously in recent years. So these are US data, and from about 39% back in 2013 to now 57% of people in 2023 describe themselves as alarmed or concerned about climate change. Now, I would argue that these numbers need to be much higher and that we have a role in accomplishing that, because I think as we make clear to people that their own health, and more importantly, to many people, the health of their children depends on climate action, that can really foster some general engagement in this. And I just put up a statement that the World Health Organization released last week. Why can't I see my time? There, okay, thank you. Okay, that they released last week, just emphasizing the critical role of health in driving climate action. Okay, so although there was a decline for sure during the pandemic in the trust in doctors and scientists, these data, which come from a 2023 survey, remind us that doctors and scientists are still relatively highly trusted. Nurses were not in that survey. When they are included, they do a little better than doctors. Okay, so as a group, we really can leverage that trust and make a difference with respect to climate. Okay, so what kinds of things can we do? So first, just to talk about education. Okay, so we can each serve as educators informally, talking to families, friends, and communities. And there's actually some reasonable evidence that when people hear from someone they trust that that person is concerned about climate change, that they themselves care more and are more apt to support legislation to address climate. We also need to be educating our trainees. It's really critical. It's been pointed out people have to be prepared to recognize new illnesses that they're not used to seeing in their areas. And I want to say that there's real progress going on in that in curricula across the country and outside the US. And I would say just at my own institution, largely driven by students and trainees, climate change is now part of the curriculum at Harvard Medical School. It's part of the internal medicine residency curriculum at the Mass General Brigham. And those are important. For anybody who's actually interested in adding climate change to things that they already talk about, or perhaps getting involved in developing resources, I just included on the lower left a resource that is based at Columbia but involves a large number of academic medical centers to make materials available, slide sets, et cetera, to teach on health effects of climate change on different conditions, including those related to women's health. And then I do want to just mention the New England Journal, like other journals, is paying more attention to this problem. We fully recognize the gravity of it, and there's a lot of information that's readily available in that regard. For anybody who has not looked, we have a climate page. You can access really all of our content on these issues. Okay, we not only have to educate our trainees, we have to educate our patients. And so identifying those at high risk for the harms of air pollution and extreme heat is quite important. Obviously, again, including pregnant women, including older women, those who are low income, living in urban heat islands, et cetera. And then advising them how they can minimize risks. For example, checking heat indices and air quality indices before they go out, avoiding exposures outside when risks are high and they are able to do that, considering an air filter, adequacy of cooling in their homes, et cetera. We should also be discussing with patients that several policies or behaviors that reduce greenhouse gas emissions are also good for their health. So you've already heard, plant-based diets. I would add, walking or biking when possible instead of driving. Okay, we can also use our trusted voices in legislative advocacy, and again, probably going to be more powerful right now at the local and state levels than at the federal level, but we really need to keep working at this. We cannot give up. So that can involve, contacting our legislators and explaining health impacts of proposed legislation that affects greenhouse gas or pollutant emissions, proposed legislation regarding resilience to climate impacts, et cetera. As we're doing this, we really need to keep in mind those who are most affected and really amplify those voices. And I would just note for anyone who's interested in getting involved in this who has not been, it can be really helpful just to join an advocacy group, not because you have to go to their meetings, but you'll get mailings about legislation on which your input would be really helpful, and it just provides a nice framework to do that. It's very important that health professionals begin to take on fossil fuel company disinformation campaigns. And I really want to highlight this because, as I think many of you know, like cigarette companies, fossil fuel companies have consistently and willfully misled the public for ages about the harms of fossil fuels. And it's actually known, and many of you may have seen this in congressional hearings and such, that decades ago, scientists at fossil fuel companies predicted the precise temperature rises that we're seeing now. There's a graph sort of comparing what they predicted with what we're seeing. Their response to those predictions was to sow false scientific skepticism, like in those advertorials that are showing up in the New York Times and other newspapers, and also to fund politicians against the public interest. And I would point out that even though the sort of language of the fossil fuel companies has changed in some of the content, the intent to deceive has not changed. Okay, so what can health professionals do? There are increasing numbers of health professionals who are involved in divestment campaigns at their institution, so either divesting the endowment of an institution or the retirement funds in which we're all putting our money and moving them out of fossil fuels and into either renewable energy, but more importantly, sustainable and equitable investment opportunities. In Canada, doctors are, been calling for bans on fossil fuel advertising. I would also note that there's a number of physicians now that are working with others on these Make Polluters Pay campaigns. So basically to hold fossil fuel companies accountable for health harms as well as other damages that are coming from their products. And I, being in Pennsylvania, I put up, an effort in Bucks County where there was a loss of life, as you know, from flash floods. And I would just mention a new physician organization called Fossil Free for Health, relatively new, that is actually a coalition of multiple healthcare organizations across the country that is really trying to work on bringing attention to the misinformation and the harms in the same way as was done with cigarettes, which was really an effective campaign. Just super quickly, we can engage in our own institutions. We know that healthcare actually accounts for about 8.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So just cleaning up our own house, using renewable energy when possible, avoiding high emissions anesthetic gases like desflurane, and reducing waste. Okay, and then finally, just want to mention one other thing, which is that there are some physicians who are out there involving in nonviolent direct action, either, you see on the left, against new fossil fuel infrastructure together with other stakeholders, but then additionally actually against the big banks that are financing our fossil fuel infrastructure expansion. So just a little figure before I close up. Since the time of the Paris Agreement, the 60 largest banks have invested almost $7 trillion in the fossil fuel industry, about half of which is related to fossil fuel expansion. So just important to know that. And while this may not be appealing to many of you and it may seem extreme, I just want to share a quote from the editor of The Lancet who noted that really doctors and health professionals have a responsibility to engage in these sorts of actions, that it is, quote, the duty of the doctor. Just want to point out that sometimes these efforts fail, but there have been real successes in which health professionals were involved, and I'm focusing here on the US. So in many states, fracking bans or commitments to 100% renewable energy by 2040 or 2050, and then over 1,600 institutions have committed to divesting from fossil fuels, and that includes medical organizations like the AMA. Okay, to conclude, I just have a quote here from the UN Secretary General, and I want to emphasize that really now is the time, and that the more of us who get involved, the greater our impact will be. Thank you.